The Long Feast, a recovered account of the Waugh Drive bat colony and the dissolution of Houston. Compiled from field recordings, municipal records, and survivor testimony by Dr. Anise Tron-Kowalski. Department of Urban Mythography, University of Galveston, 2091. Prefatory note: the following account is disputed. The colony's defenders maintain that correlation is not causation, that cities fracture for reasons that require no supernatural explanation. I note this objection and set it aside. I have spent 11 years with these materials. I know what I believe. What I believe begins not with the bats themselves, but with what replaced them. Prologue: what Harvey proved. To understand what was lost, you must first understand what existed. In August of 2017, a storm called Harvey dropped 60 inches of rain on the city of Houston over 4 days. The flooding was, by any measure, catastrophic. Tens of thousands of homes filled with water. People clung to rooftops. A family drowned in a van. What happened next became, for a certain generation, almost a point of civic religion. Strangers with boats appeared. Not rescue workers, ordinary people who had trailers and pickup trucks and a simple, unasked understanding that their neighbors needed to be removed from the water. There are photographs from this period that survivors describe with a particular quality in their voices. The kind of voice people reserve for things they witnessed and no longer fully believe. A man called Matthew, in a Texans jersey, pulling an elderly woman out of a second-floor window. Children passed hand to hand above the waterline by people who did not know each other's names. The waiting lists to volunteer grew so long that coordinators turned people away. The sociologists called it emergent prosociality. The people who lived it called it Houston. This is what was taken. I want that understood before we proceed. Part 1. The Original Colony, 1992 to 2017. You must understand what the real bats were like. This matters. The colony under the Waugh Drive Bridge was first formally documented in the mid-1990s, though Montrose residents reported noticing them earlier, perhaps as early as 1992. The accepted estimate settled around 250,000 Mexican free-tailed bats. The watching became a civic ritual. A non-profit formed. A webcam. People stood at the railing at dusk and felt, reliably, something loosen in them. This loosening was real. I am not being poetic. Multiple independent studies documented measurable reductions in self-reported anxiety and interpersonal hostility among people who regularly observed the emergence. The naturalists attributed it to awe, to scale, to the quality of light over the bayou. The people who watched most nights developed a different theory, one they were reluctant to state directly. The bats, they felt, were eating something. Taking something off the city, like heat rising off pavement. The darkness you'd accumulated, in traffic, in the slow erosions of the working day, went up with the spiral and did not come back down. You drove home lighter. Margaret Elspeth Broussard, who watched the emergence nearly every evening for 19 years, and is perhaps the most important witness in this entire account, described it this way in a 2031 interview. You know how a room feels after you've opened the windows? Not just cooler, different in some way you can't account for. That's what it was. Every night, that bridge was an open window for the whole city. She paused, then added, "The ones that came back weren't like that. I want to make sure you write that down. The ones that came back closed the windows." Part 2. The Bridge Empties. August 24th, 2017. Harvey made landfall on August 25th. The rains reached Houston the following day. What no one reported at the time, what exists only in the personal journals of 3 nightly observers, and in one brief, confused post to a birding forum that was never answered, is that the bridge was already empty. On the evening of August 24th, the night before the storm arrived, the emergence did not happen. Carolyn Vasquez, one of the 3 journal keepers, wrote, "Went at the usual time. Waited until full dark. Nothing. Not nothing like a slow night. Nothing like a held breath. The bridge just sat there. Went home and the sky was already going wrong in the south." The birding forum post, submitted by a user named WawWatcher88 at 11:47 p.m. on August 24th, read simply, "Has anyone else been down to the bridge tonight? I don't know how to describe this. Where did they go?" This is, as far as my research has been able to determine, the last documented observation of the original colony. The storm came. The bayou swallowed the bridge. The water eventually receded. And then, roughly 3 weeks later, they came back. Or something did. Part 3. The Return. The first accounts of the return describe a specific quality of relief. Of course they came back. Where else would they go? The bridge was intact. The city was wet and wounded, but standing. Of course the bats came back. Margaret Broussard was at the railing the first evening. She had been going every night since the water dropped, finding nothing, returning again. She saw the emergence begin, the first shapes appearing from the concrete seams in the last light, and she felt something she initially interpreted as joy. Then she looked more carefully. "It took me a few minutes," she told me in our first interview, her voice carrying the specific flatness of someone who has told a true thing and not been believed. "At first, I thought it was the light, or that I'd just forgotten. It had been a month almost. You forget things. But I stood there and I watched and I thought, those are not the same." I asked her what was different. She was quiet for a long time. "Everything," she finally said. "And nothing you could point to." Part 4. The Testimonies. This is where the record becomes difficult to assemble, because the witnesses who noticed consistently struggled to articulate what they noticed. I have collected 47 such accounts. What follows is a compression of their recurring observations. On color. The original bats were brown, a particular brown, warm, almost reddish in certain lights, the color of river water in late afternoon. Multiple observers who had watched for years described the returning colony as darker. Not dramatically, not black, just a brown that had gone a shade further than it should, as if the color had been mixed by someone working from memory rather than observation. One observer, a painter named Deshawn Arsenault, said, "It was the same brown the way a photocopy is the same as the original. You'd almost not notice, but you would notice." On movement. Mexican free-tailed bats are fast. Extravagantly, almost aggressively fast. They are among the quickest animals on the planet, built for pursuit, for the specific violence of insect interception at speed. The original colony's emergence had a quality of urgency, of barely contained velocity held in check only by the density of bodies. Multiple observers described the returning colony as moving with a different quality. Purposeful rather than urgent. Calm in a way that made some people uneasy without knowing why. They weren't hunting, Waugh Watcher 88, whom I eventually identified and interviewed, told me. They looked like they were going somewhere they'd already been. On sound. Bat echolocation is largely ultrasonic, beyond human hearing. But the emergence of a colony of hundreds of thousands produces a texture of sound, a leathery percussion, a high chittering at the edges of frequency. Two observers, independently, described the returning colony as quieter than they remembered. Not silent, just quieter. One said, like the sound was coming from further away than it was. On feeling. This is the most consistent report, and the hardest to categorize. The loosening, the open window sensation that had characterized the watching for 20 years, was gone. In its place, witnesses described something they struggled to name. Not dread exactly, not hostility. Several used the word hollow. One woman, who asked not to be identified, described standing at the railing after the return and feeling as if something was paying attention to her. Not the bats, something behind the bats. Like when you're in a costume shop, she said, and you realize someone's watching you through the eye holes of one of the masks. Part 5. Dr. Achebe-Osei's notes. Dr. Patience Achebe-Osei had spent 30 years studying urban bat colonies. She was at the bridge within a week of the return, and her field notes from this period are the most precise record we have. She measured wingspan. She recorded flight patterns. She collected guano samples for analysis and took acoustic readings and did everything a rigorous field ecologist does, and her notes are meticulous and controlled until the final entry of her first visit, written at the bottom of an otherwise technical page in handwriting that is slightly larger than her usual script. The echolocation pattern is wrong. Not wrong the way an injured animal is wrong. Wrong the way a recording is wrong. The frequency signatures are correct. The intervals are correct. But there is nothing behind them. I don't know how to write this more precisely than that. Real echolocation has a quality of searching, of genuine inquiry. The pulse goes out, and there is a moment of waiting, of orientation before the next pulse. These don't wait. They already know where everything is. They are not searching. They have never needed to search. She submitted her paper 3 years later. It was rejected without peer review. The editor's note called it speculative to the point of irresponsibility. She noted in her journal that she had almost not submitted it because the paper, as written, said nothing about the thing that had actually frightened her in those first field sessions. The paper spoke of neurochemical foraging, of atmospheric compounds, of supplementary feeding behaviors. It did not say what she had written in the field. They already know where everything is. She did not return to the bridge for 2 years after the return. When she finally went back, she went at midnight, alone, and she did not go to observe. She went, she wrote, because I needed to see whether I was right to be afraid. Her notes from that visit are a single line. I was right. She never explained what she saw. Those pages, if they existed, are not among the materials recovered from her apartment after her death in 2068. Part 6. The Mechanism. 2017 to 2055. The original bats ate mosquitoes. Start there because it matters. A single Mexican free-tailed bat consumes several thousand mosquitoes in a single night's foraging. Multiply that across 250,000 animals and you arrive at a number that staggers. Billions of insects extracted from the air above the Bayou City every warm season evening. Each one a small carrier of misery, of West Nile, of the particular psychic tax that is simply existing in a subtropical city in August. The original colony performed, night after night, an act of literal civic sanitation. They took the things that drained you. They ate what made the city hard to live in. This was their function. This was, I think, the terms of whatever arrangement had been struck between the colony and the city, formalized over the slow decades of their cohabitation into something resembling mutual benefit. The city generated nuisance. The bats consumed it. The ledger balanced. Which is why the ledger, when it tipped so completely. Because what came back was not performing a service. What came back was feeding. The distinction is not subtle once you see it. The janitor takes what you no longer need, the accumulated grime, the residue, the waste product of ordinary living. You are lighter for it. You never miss what's gone. What came back took the other thing. Not the mosquitoes, not the irritants, not the small daily corrosions that the real bats had spent 20 years quietly removing. What came back fed on what made the removal possible in the first place. On the patience that let you laugh off the traffic rather than carry it home. On the tolerance that looked at the stranger beside you at the railing and felt, for a moment, something like kinship. On the very capacity that had made the watching pleasurable, that had made the city what the city was, that renewable resource, that deep aquifer of goodwill that Houston had spent decades not knowing it had, because it had never been tested the way Celestine would eventually test it. The mosquitoes during these years returned. Of course they did. Without the colony, the real colony, the one that had known its function, there was nothing to hold them back. By 2030, the complaints in bayou-adjacent neighborhoods had reached levels not seen since the 1980s. The city sprayed. It sprayed again. The mosquitoes persisted. Nobody connected this to anything. Why would they? The bats were still there. You could see them every evening, the spiral against the dusk sky, the familiar spectacle. Of course the bats were still there. But they had stopped eating mosquitoes. Field observations, properly analyzed, show the dietary shift beginning almost immediately after the return. The new colony ranging in flight patterns inconsistent with insect pursuit, moving at altitudes and speeds that no prey item adequately explains, foraging in weather conditions that real free-tailed bats reliably avoid. Dr. Achebe-Osei noted this in her field records and filed it under behavioral anomaly, uncertain what to do with it. Reluctant to write down what the anomaly, added to all the other anomalies, seemed to suggest. What it suggested was this: they were not there for the mosquitoes. They had never been there for the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes were what the real bats had eaten because the real bats needed protein, and the city offered it in abundance. What occupied the bridge now needed something the city also offered in abundance, something richer, something that took longer to digest, something that had to be extracted at altitude on long, slow circuits above sleeping neighborhoods and evening commutes and Little League games and hospital waiting rooms and all the 10,000 daily situations in which a human being either extends themselves toward another or does not. The mosquitoes came back because nothing was eating them. And the city, more slowly, more invisibly, more catastrophically, emptied out for the same reason. Nothing was eating them either anymore. Only the city itself didn't know that yet. It still felt, in the early years, like something was being consumed, like the old open window sensation was still operating. It felt lighter after watching the emergence. It drove home easier. But what it was losing was not the weight it could afford to lose. Part 7. What the city lost, year by year. This section is difficult to write because the data is mundane. Civic trust surveys, traffic incident reports, next-door forum archives, volunteer hours, church attendance figures, the records of which neighborhoods showed up for which neighbors after which floods. Numbers. But behind the numbers, if you read long enough, you begin to feel the shape of the subtraction. In 2022, a Montrose resident named Achebe-Osei, no relation to Dr. Achebe-Osei, posted to his neighborhood forum asking if anyone had a truck he could borrow to help a family 3 streets over who had lost their fence in a storm. He received 11 responses. Offers of trucks, of hands, of an afternoon. In 2031, a resident of the same neighborhood made the same request. 2 people responded. One asked what he was offering in exchange. In 2041, nobody asked at all. You didn't ask strangers for things anymore. The asking had started to feel dangerous, or foolish, or faintly humiliating in a way no one could have explained, but everyone understood. Margaret Broussard, in our final interview before her death in 2069, put it this way: "You ever try to remember a word and it's just not there? You know you used to have it. You can feel the shape of where it was." That's what the city felt like by the end. Full of shapes where things used to be. Part 8. September 2073. The storm's name was Celestine. Category 4 at landfall. It stalled over the city for 31 hours. The flooding was, by every physical measure, less severe than Harvey had been 56 years earlier. The death toll was 4,211. Harvey's had been 36. What I want to resist, what every prior account of Celestine has failed to resist, is the temptation to make the storm the explanation, to let the water bear the weight of what happened. Water is legible. Water can be measured and modeled and assigned blame and learned from. Water lets the story have a shape that feels like cause and effect, like a thing that could have been prevented with better infrastructure, better warning systems, better emergency management. These accounts are not wrong, but they are looking at the last domino and calling it the force. The collapse of Houston did not begin in September 2073. It did not begin with Celestine. By the time the storm arrived, the city had already been hollowing for 20 years. The civic trust numbers knew it. The next-door archives knew it. The volunteer rosters knew it. The blood drives that no longer filled. The neighborhood associations that dissolved mid-decade for lack of anyone willing to chair them. The subtle migration of people who gave reasons about jobs or schools or cost of living, but who, when pressed by researchers like myself, described something harder to name. A feeling the city had stopped giving back. A feeling of living alongside people rather than among them. Celestine did not drain Houston. Celestine revealed what had already been drained. This is the important distinction, and it changes what Celestine means. It was not a disaster that broke a healthy city. It was a pressure test administered to a city that had, over 2 decades and without knowing it, become something that could no longer bear pressure. The water rose, as water in Houston had always risen. And the response that had always risen with it, that extraordinary, unasked-for reflex of neighbor toward neighbor, simply was not there. Not because people chose not to help, because the capacity to choose it, the instinct that made the choice feel obvious and urgent and human, had been quietly, incrementally, completely consumed. The storm found an empty room. It moved through quickly. It left the furniture. Only later did anyone notice nothing was left alive in it. The Senate testimony is a catalog of these moments. A man on a fence post. a child on a roof, a woman who held on for 6 hours to a highway barrier while people on the overpass above her looked at their phones, looked at her, looked at their phones again. I kept thinking someone would come, she testified. I kept thinking, this is Houston. Someone will come. We do this. This is what we do. Nobody came. She survived because the water eventually receded. She moved to Austin the following spring. She did not describe making this decision. She described simply finding herself there, the way you find yourself in a room and can't remember crossing to it. Interlude, the bridge, the night of the storm. This is not documented. I include it because several survivors independently reported the same thing, and I have stopped dismissing the things that multiple people report independently. During Celestine, at the height of the flooding, in the early hours of the morning when the water was at its peak and the bridge was surrounded on all sides, several people who sheltered in elevated structures with sightlines to the Waugh Drive bridge reported seeing the emergence. Not the nightly emergence. It was 3 a.m, in the middle of a hurricane. But something was in the air above the bridge, moving in the dark and the rain, moving in the spiral pattern. Not feeding on insects, not feeding on anything the witnesses could name, but feeding. They were all certain of that. Something was being consumed in enormous quantity in the dark above the flooding. One witness, a man who had ridden out the storm in a parking structure on Allen Parkway, described it this way. There was all this out there. All this, I don't know how to say it. Fear, maybe. People holding on, people crying, people in the water. And whatever was up there was just moving through it, like it was warm. Like warmth was coming off all of it, and the things up there were cold. He stopped. I don't go to the bridge anymore, he said. I haven't since. Some people still go. I don't understand that. I saw what I saw. Epilogue. The colony remains, but does not. I'm writing this in 2091. 23 years after Celestine, 18 years after the city was formally depopulated by the state of Texas, its remaining infrastructure decommissioned, its streets returned by degrees to the water and the reed grass and the slow, flat patience of the coastal plain that had always been underneath. Nobody connected the bats to any of this. I want to be precise about that. In 23 years of post-collapse inquiry, the Senate investigations, the academic literature, the documentary films, the oral history projects, the journalistic reconstructions. Not one account, not one footnote, not one paragraph has drawn a line between the colony under the Waugh Drive bridge and the long unwinding of the city that had sheltered it. There are accounts that mention the bats in passing, as local color, as the kind of detail that makes Houston feel specific and strange and worth mourning. But the connection, the mechanism, the return, the before and after, the thing that Margaret Broussard knew the night she stood at the railing and felt the window close, has not appeared in the record until this document. I tell myself this is because the evidence required a particular kind of looking, that you had to hold the naturalist's notes alongside the civic trust surveys, alongside the next-door archives, alongside the flood mortality data, alongside the testimony of people who had stood at a railing in the dusk and felt, with a certainty they could not justify, that what they were watching was not what it appeared to be. That only an urban mythographer, a discipline that barely existed before the collapse, and perhaps only exists now because of it, would think to gather these things into the same room and see what they said to each other. I tell myself this. I am not entirely sure I believe it. I think the more honest answer is that people did not want to look at the bridge too carefully, even after everything. That the wanting not to look was itself a residue of the extraction. That whatever occupied that bridge had been thorough enough in its work that the very impulse to investigate it, to point at it and name it, had been among the first things taken. The city could not protect itself because it could not recognize what was feeding on it. This is, I think, a very old dynamic. It appears in older mythologies than this one. In any case, it cannot be solved now. This is the final cruelty of the record, and I have thought about how to write it for a long time. The Waugh Drive bridge is still there. I have seen it from the air, on the survey flights the university conducts over the inundation zone, hiding underneath the surface of the marsh water at low tide, surprisingly intact. The bayou and the gulf and the slow catastrophe of the intervening years have converted most of what was Houston into a landscape that appears, from altitude, to have been there always. Water and cordgrass and the white punctuation of egrets, broken only by the upper floors of buildings that refuse to sink, and by the bridge. The colony is gone. Whatever it was, wherever it came from, whatever arrangement it had made with the darkness and the hunger and the long patience required to drain a city of millions across a span of decades, it is gone. No one has reported the emergence since the final evacuation. Whatever came back after Harvey did not stay to watch what it had accomplished. Or perhaps it moved on. Perhaps there is a protocol to this kind of thing, a sense of when a place has been fully used, when the well has given everything it has to give, and it is time to find another railing, another skyline, another city full of people who have no idea what they have and therefore have not yet learned to protect it. I do not know where it went. I do not know what it is. I know what it did, or I believe I know, which is as close as this kind of history ever gets to certainty. What I know with certainty is this: the evidence is 30 feet underwater. The witnesses are scattered or dead. The city that might have answered these questions is a marsh, and the marsh keeps its own counsel. And the egrets that pick through what remains of Montrose at low tide are only egrets, eating only what egrets eat, performing no function but their own. Whatever came to the bridge in the fall of 2017 is the only thing that knows the full shape of what happened here. And it is not, as far as I can determine, the kind of thing that keeps records. The Waugh Drive Bridge is located within Texas Inundation Zone 7, accessible only by permit. Unauthorized entry is prohibited under the Gulf Coast Reclamation Act of 2081.